What's going on, guys? You go to church? Are you part of a church that you're just not really sure is the right fit, or are you just wondering what else is out there? Well, if any of those are you, I'd like to help you out. You see, I recently went through this process myself where I was getting back into the faith and reading the Bible again for the first time in a long time, and I just discovered that my convictions didn't really line up how they used to. So I actually began the process and went from a Baptist church to a Lutheran church that I attend now. And along the way, I kind of developed this 10-step process that I'm sharing now in this series. And today we're discussing step number 3, which is study. So I appreciate you guys coming by the channel. I appreciate you guys giving me some time in your day. The name's a bit ironic because it's cut to the chase, but I love to ramble because I am an old man in a young man's body. So, but I appreciate if you just give me a few minutes. I want to share some ideas with you on how to study in preparation to begin your church search process. And the goal of this process overall, and I'm going to be linking all these videos in the description, the goal is to make sure you're not spending too much time making sure you don't turn into this perpetual church hopper where you never really put roots down anywhere, because that's very important. You need to become a part of a local congregation, and once you find that congregation, you need to really stay there. So today we're going to talk about how to begin to learn the differences between the major options you've got here. So we're not down at the level yet today where you're thinking of an individual church. We're kind of thinking of the groups of churches, the major branches and traditions of Christianity. And I've got a list here. So we're going to start off talking about this list. And a lot of these, we're going to kind of go roughly in order of kind of when they first developed and came onto the scene, going all the way back to the early church period. And I'll give you a couple quick details about them. We're not going to discuss the in-depth details of what each of these traditions believe. I would love to do that one day, but there are other Christians out there on YouTube who have already done that and done a fantastic job. I'm going to link a couple of their channels in the description here because I use them myself, and they really helped me to learn a lot really quickly and explained it very simply, and that is Redeemed Zoomer and Ready to Harvest. To this day, even though I am in a church that I'm now a member of, I still love watching their videos. I love continuing to learn more all the time. But this list, we're going to start at the top. So this first group is what we're going to call the ecclesialist traditions. So as I go down this list, these are all possible options that I think a Christian can reasonably consider. So starting at the very top, you have what is called the Church of the East. Now, they have a few names. I think most often you're going to hear them as the Assyrian Church of the East. And this one might be a little bit controversial because for a long time they have been thought of as Nestorians, which is a type of heresy. But as time has gone on and some inter-church, interdenominational dialogues have been taking place, they appear to not be as committed to this heretical position as they once were believed to. A key lesson here, a key thing that you will need to familiarize yourself with is something called an ecumenical council. So what an ecumenical council is, to oversimplify it, so when the church in the early 300s AD, when they were first kind of coming out of this era of being persecuted for 300 years under the Roman Empire, kind of off and on, church leaders were beginning to be gathered into these councils because different issues were coming up. Now that they didn't have to focus so much on just surviving under the threat of persecution, church leaders could gather in the open now, often with the Roman Empire or some other government's blessing and involvement, in order to hash out publicly the issues of the day, to really clarify church teaching. And the first and most famous of those is the Council of Nicaea in 325. And this first church, the Church of the East, so there are seven ecumenical councils that are kind of seen as the core. There are more councils that continued to go on over time, but as time goes on, more and more churches began to kind of break off as there were major disagreements over the main topics of discussions at these councils, because once these councils were done, they came out with a bunch of basically new rulings, and it was seen as basically binding. Again, oversimplifying here. So the Church of the East agreed with the first two councils, but when the third arose, the Council of Ephesus in 431, they disagreed with the discussion of the day and became began to do their own thing. They're kind of the first major group to really, that you could still probably call more or less truly Christian, that began to kind of do their own thing. And they are still a church today. And interestingly enough, because we're going to mention what's called the Great Schism, which is a divide between the Eastern and Western Christian church, the Church of the East is even further east than the Eastern Orthodox. So to them, everyone is Western Christian. So there you got agreement on two ecumenical councils, and then they're doing their own thing. So the next group of churches we're going to talk about is the Oriental Orthodox traditions. So these are all these ecclesialist churches. These are very high church, lots of liturgy and, priestly garments and processions and smells and bells and all that stuff. Very old traditions. And the Oriental Orthodox are in this family here. Now, they are kind of interesting because they're not a unified body here. They're actually broken up into a few different kind of self-governing churches, but they all have a lot of theology in common. And I think to different degrees they're in communion with one another, but you've got the Armenians, the Coptics, the Ethiopians, the Syriac, the Eritreans, and the Malankara Indians. I don't know if there's more than that. I've known of the main four, the first four that I just read. The other two I recently learned about, so I don't know all the details of that organization, but kind of what they have in common is where the Church of the East broke off after that second council, these guys stuck around and actually agreed with the Council of Ephesus and stuck around until 451 AD, when the Council of Chalcedon became an issue. And they disagreed with the final ruling with the Council of Chalcedon, and so they began to also do their own thing. So now you have kind of the main greater church, but then you have the Church of the East now doing their own thing, and now you have these Oriental Orthodox churches that are each kind of in these spread out areas are kind of beginning to do their own thing now too. So this is way before the Protestant Reformation. There's already starting to be divisions in the church body. Next up, we have the Eastern Orthodox tradition. So this is the last of the Orthodox, and this is probably the most well-known one. There are a lot of more or less autonomous churches in there with varying degrees of communion with one another. But in general, the Eastern Orthodox stuck around for a lot longer. And I got to be careful with my wording here. And I know, guys, I'm going to say something wrong. You guys are going to disagree and get mad at me. If you are Catholic or Orthodox or any of these other groups, I apologize. My intent is not to upset you. It's not to misrepresent your tradition. This is just the best way that I understand, and I'm trying to briefly communicate this. So the Eastern Orthodox stuck around for those first 7. So all Eastern Orthodox firmly hold to those first 7 ecumenical councils. Now, like I said, councils continued to happen. So some of these Eastern Orthodox groups agree with more than 7, but they all agree with at least 7. However, in the year 1054, there's unfortunately one of the biggest divisions in Christianity is what's known as the Great Schism. And this happened because there was, over time, kind of mounting disagreements and points of tension between Christians that tended to be more from the West and Christians that tended to be more from the East. And it came to kind of a final breaking point in 1054 when the Patriarch of, I believe, Constantinople and a representative of the Pope in Rome excommunicated one another. So they completely broke one another off from the church. So that had the effect of not just these individuals excommunicating one another, but their entire respective traditions also went with one another. So all of a sudden, there was this massive rift between East and West. And you saw, well, I guess at this point they had been conquered by Islam, but you saw the four sees, so Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, the four major centers of Christianity, all went east, and Rome was the only remaining major seat that went west. And we can talk about more details another day. I still need to do a lot more studying myself on the details of all this stuff, but that's the Eastern Orthodox. So they are the ones that were on the eastern side of that break. And then the ones on the west came to be known as the Roman Catholic Church, which is the last major group here that we're talking about in this ecclesialist family. So, and another big, like I mentioned earlier, another kind of common theme in all these churches is that they tend to have a claim of that they are the correct church, that everyone else has departed from them. So when I just mentioned that East-West rift, I'm not trying to intentionally cast it as the Roman Catholic Church was definitely in the right and the Eastern Orthodox broke off. There's disagreement. There's each kind of has their arguments and their way that they see, because the Eastern Orthodox see it as the West broke away from them and we're trying to seize too much power, and actually were responsible for the break. So that's the best that I understand it as someone who has never been Catholic or Orthodox myself. Moving on. So everyone's kind of doing their thing for a while until the 1500s roll around. And then we have a major division in the church develop that you're probably here in the United States a lot more familiar with, and that is the Protestant Reformation. And that's because the United States has a long Protestant history. We are overwhelmingly Protestant, or at least we used to be. Now, I use this term very deliberately. So these churches, people use Protestant to basically refer to anything that's not Catholic or Orthodox. I am in the camp where I think we need to start narrowing down what Protestant actually means. And I think Protestant churches, and this is coming directly from Redeemed Zoomer, are churches that came directly out of the Protestant Reformation. And what does that mean? Well, it means that they have kind of a direct connection to Rome. They don't submit to the Pope. They're not Roman Catholic, but their theological stances were all in direct response to Rome. So those churches are the Lutheran Church, the Reformed Church, and I'm including Presbyterians here, so you got all your continental Reformed churches and your Presbyterians, the Anglicans, or Episcopalians if you're in the United States, and the Congregationalists. So these are all the proper, and you can kind of throw the Moravians in there too. I think they're kind of related to the Reformed, but I guess they're also kind of their own thing. There's probably another group or two in there, but these are all the direct, properly Protestant churches here. Congregationalists are technically an offshoot of the Anglican Church. It wasn't a dramatic break. It was something that happened over time. So these are Puritans is another word for the Congregationalists. So big part of American history. And it wasn't like an intentional schism from the Anglican Church. It kind of just happened over time. And honestly, political events played a huge part of why they ultimately wound up as their own thing. So then we kind of move into this gray area as we keep going down these different traditions where, depending on who you are, you can kind of make the case that they're technically Protestant, or maybe some of them are Protestant, some of them aren't. And that group's going to include the Methodists. That's going to include the Baptists. So the Baptists are the ones I'm most familiar with. So I would say briefly, if you are a Baptist that follows the 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith, I think you are probably a Protestant. If you are just a General Baptist out of the modern day Southern Baptist Convention, you are not Protestant. You are an Evangelical. And I'm not trying to be mean or disparaging at all with these terms. All I mean is that there are an increasing amount of differences between these more classical Protestant churches and everybody else that everyone just calls Protestant. So we also include the Mennonites and the Anabaptists here, the Holiness movement, so Methodists are another one that kind of came out. So a lot of these actually are kind of derivatives of the Anglican Church. So Methodists came out of the Anglican Church, emerged is kind of how I would probably say that. Baptists, kind of same thing, emerged out of the Anglican Church. I think Anabaptists were kind of their own thing. They might even be more out of the Protestant. I don't know much about the Anabaptists. I won't pretend to. And then the Holiness movement kind of emerged out of the Methodist tradition. So they're super Methodists. And then you have the Evangelical Free Church, which kind of emerged out of the specifically Scandinavian branch of Lutheranism. So those last two, Holiness and Evangelical Free, are really just barely, they're probably not really truly Protestant, but they're kind of just their own thing. But then we move into the last group, which is evangelicals, which are basically people not at all Protestant. And again, that's not supposed to be a bad thing to call you. It's just who you are and how your church came to be has nothing to do with the Roman Catholic Church. What are you protesting? The Lutheran Church is protesting the papacy and a lot of the doctrines that were in error at the time of the Reformation that have still yet to be resolved, our two bodies have yet to come to a common understanding and acceptance over. But the Pentecostals, the Non-Denominationals, and the Restorationist churches, this includes the Churches of Christ as well as the Disciples of Christ, none of these are Protestant. These are evangelical churches. They don't have any connection whatsoever to the Protestant Reformation, other than relation to possibly other bodies that might have had a direct connection to the Protestant Reformation. But they are not Catholic, not Orthodox, and they've kind of just appeared on their own, or they've had such a dramatic break with other proper Protestant churches that they're just their own thing. So you kind of have this gray zone that I'm calling borderline heretical, because I see significant issues with each of these. So from this point on, I would steer clear of the rest of these churches. Up until this point, I wouldn't be comfortable going to like a Pentecostal church, but that might be something that you might be interested in. And I think they are Christians. I don't think they're not Christians. They may have a lot of theology I disagree with, but hey. But these I would steer clear of. So you got your borderline hereticals here. This is your Messianic Jews. And the reason why is they get dangerously close to Judaizing, which is read the Epistle of Galatians if you want to know what the issues are with that. Quakers, who I think are barely Christian at this point, and Seventh-day Adventists. So I think you have some Seventh-day Adventists that are Christian, but that church overall has so many issues and so many errors when it comes to more Orthodox Christian doctrines that I would never be comfortable in those churches. And then you have some that are definitely heretical, that you need to avoid these entirely. And that is your New Apostolic Reformation churches, your Latter-day Saints churches or Mormons, your Oneness Pentecostals. So regular Pentecostals, you're fine. Oneness Pentecostals specifically preach a heretical form of the Trinity. So you need to steer, if you find yourself in a Oneness Pentecostal church, you need to get far away from there. Your Jehovah's Witnesses, your Unitarians and Universalists, your Christian Science, and I could put in 100 other churches here. But if you're in any of those, these need to not be considered, waste your time at all. We will talk another day about some of those churches and why I don't think they are truly Christian churches and why they shouldn't be considered, but this video is not the place for that. So, the last major thing I want to talk about is kind of this template that I want to share with you. And I apologize, I am not yet good with editing, so I don't have this like on the screen for you. I'm going to put this in the description so you can kind of look at it, and then you can kind of use it as your own template. So I'm going to go down the list, So we've got block 1 and kind of block 2. So block 1, you're going to have your sections for a church. So this is going to be something you can kind of put on a piece of paper. You put all these like headers on there, and then you're going to use this to kind of fill in the blanks as you are exploring the churches that you have around, which is what we're going to get into with the next video. But we're going to cross over. So I'm going to give you this list, and then I'm going to give you an example of all these filled out. So you got your church, your tradition, your denomination. So the difference between tradition and denomination. So everything I talked about in that list before, those are all traditions. Denominations get more specific. So again, we'll discuss that here in a second. Church, tradition, denomination, theological disposition, which is, are they conservative or not? And we're talking theology here, not politics. Are they confessional? And if they are, what is that confession? Are they creedal? And what creeds do they subscribe to? And finally, kind of what's their style? And we're thinking more like high, middle, low church here. So that's your first block. That's going to just give you a quick glance of what that church is and kind of what the most basic information is for that church. Then on block number 2, we're getting into our sections of doctrine here. So tier 1, we're not really going to spend any time on. This is all your essentials. With that first list I showed you, if you are staying out of that heretical church, you don't even need to consider it here. All the rest of them should be fine with your Christian essentials. Tier 2 is this is where you're going to make your money in this step and in this process. Most of this process should be over tier 2 issues, which are your critical issues. And that's going to include sacraments, church government, or polity, you might hear that word used, ordination, affirmations of creeds, and are they confessional? Those are other, you saw those on the first block, but you can expand upon them in here. Gender roles in the church, so we're thinking specifically other than ordination. So what do they teach about the different gender roles? Church discipline. Does that church engage in church discipline? Does it keep its members accountable? Does it preach on sin? Reverence and the purpose of the local church. So I think those are, and you can make your own case. You don't have to agree with me on all those. That's what I used. That's what I put in my tier 2 when I was searching. And then tier 3, these are your important ones. But these are tier 2. Remember, these are what can divide one tradition from another. Tier 3 are important, but under most circumstances, you shouldn't have to divide into a completely different church body over these issues. But you may still want to make note of them because it may factor into your final decision as you're coming down to like splitting the hairs over, oh, we like this at church A, but we prefer this at church B. So this is where this might come into play. And that's going to include things like your eschatology, your creation, what type of worship do they have? You know, do politics come up in the church, or do they just avoid it at all or altogether? What do they teach about the spiritual gifts? Do they preach eternal security, once saved, always saved, or do they not? And maybe even things like, do they teach that Christians have to be pacifists, which most churches don't? And then, what Bible translation would they maybe prefer? So going down this list and using my church as an example. So I attend a church called Holy Cross. So at the very top, you're going to put Holy Cross. Now in this step, when you're just researching, so you're not going to put a specific church in there, but what you should be able to do is once you have this kind of figured out for each tradition, that you don't have to do it for that whole list I mentioned earlier, but just pick maybe 2 or 3. So you're like, okay, I'm a Baptist, so I might want to see what like a Methodist church is like and what a Pentecostal church is like. So I would do this for whatever tradition you're currently in and the couple of traditions you think you might be interested in. And I would fill this out top to bottom, leave the first individual church space blank. But the rest of them, that way you can kind of get at a glance. You can see, okay, if I'm going to a Methodist church, I should probably expect these. At a Pentecostal church, I should probably expect this. That's gonna go together there. So Holy Cross tradition is Lutheran. The denomination is Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. So you see it's a little bit more specific. It's not just broadly Lutheran, but it's the specific type of Lutheran here. Another might be the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is not Lutheran. The Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Church, or Lutheran Synod, WELS. The Association of American Lutheran Churches. I think I said that right, AALC. We love our acronyms, what can I say? And then in theological disposition, I wrote conservative, confessional. And then in confessions, I put the Book of Concord of 1580. So this is kind of the constitution of the LCMS. And in that specifically includes the unaltered Augsburg Confession. So the Book of Concord is like a thick book that's got multiple confessions in it. They all complement one another and they go together. And it even includes the next step, so creeds. Yes, the LCMS is a creedal. We officially affirm, because these are in the Book of Concord, we affirm the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed. Those are officially affirmed. And then we also affirm officially the first 4 councils, unofficially up to 7, but kind of with a couple caveats here, and kind of with this understanding of they affirm them, but not infallibly so. And then the style, it ranges. Generally, LCMS is generally kind of what I would say is a middle church tradition. And that's because you kind of find a range. Some are higher. Some are going to look pretty close to what you would find at a Catholic church. Some are going to look a lot like your average Baptist church, and you're going to find kind of everything in between. The LCMS is kind of a variety. Moving into that block, I don't really have anything in Tier 1, because like I said, you don't have anything to worry about there. With this particular tradition. Tier 2, though. So sacraments, I wrote notes here. So the LCMS they acknowledge 2 and leave the door open for a 3rd sacrament. And those are Holy Baptism, Holy Communion, and Confession and Absolution. Next to baptism, I wrote they are Paedo-Baptists, so they baptize infants, and they believe in baptismal regeneration. Baptism saves. Holy Communion, for the LCMS, you want to note that they believe in the real presence. So we believe Christ is truly present in the bread and the wine, in, with, and under the elements. That's another thing I put here. I said they make sure to always serve both. So you'll never have happen in an LCMS church what you might see happen in a Roman Catholic church, which is where you have communion, but only in one kind. So they only give you the bread. A Lutheran church is always going to give you the bread and the wine. We don't believe that those should ever be separated. Every communicant should always get both. We feel very passionate about that. Confession and absolution. Confession, we don't mandate private confession, but we do still allow for it. Typically, confession is conducted corporately. And that's not to say everyone's screaming out their sins, but generally you have a time set aside in the service, in the divine service, where everyone gets on their knees and has a time to quietly confess their sins between them and God. And then usually you read a public confession together, and then the pastor will, I almost called him a priest. We don't really call them priests, we call them pastors. The pastor will pronounce your forgiveness in Christ's stead. And that is part of why the pastor is the only one that's supposed to do that. We believe, kind of similar to how the Catholics do, that he is God's representative. So he'll say something like, I forgive you. As a called and ordained servant of our Lord Jesus Christ, I forgive you all your sins. So you'll hear that. Church government. So the LCMS is what's called synodical or modified congregational. So there tends to be, if you're familiar with kind of like the way Baptists do things, all the power for the churches are almost completely autonomous. There's a little bit that they associate together into the larger convention, but almost everything's done at the local level. LCMS is mostly that way, but there are some exceptions. You do kind of have people that function, they don't call them this, but you do have people that function as kind of bishops and then an archbishop. There is more of a system of accountability, more of a hierarchy in the LCMS. But it still gives a lot of power to the local congregation. Ordination, LCMS. So as I'm going through these are all things that I noted next to these different lines of information. So ordination. LCMS is a male pastor-only tradition. There are unordained deaconesses, and I had to kind of look at this because I was kind of like, well, that's weird because the Bible kind of shows that deacons are supposed to be male. But in this context, how I kind of understood them is they're kind of like the Lutheran version of a nun, and that's probably way off, but that's how my mind kind of rationalized it. But if that's an issue for you, you may want to avoid it. And then apostolic succession is something that is a big deal in those ecclesialist churches, but is not so much in Protestant churches, with the exception of Anglicans and certain Lutherans. So apostolic succession is technically still practiced in a way, because even though they don't really record the line of bishops, the ordination ceremony is always a laying on of hands from one clergy to another. And there's usually multiple clergy involved. So from what I understand, any Lutheran pastor watching this, if I am off the mark on any of this, please correct me. I welcome your correction and your teaching. But you have kind of what's called like pastoral succession or presbyter succession is kind of more what's going on, but not a clear like apostolic succession. Except for, I believe, the Church of Sweden, I think, keeps it going. Affirmation of the creeds, already mentioned. They affirm the Apostles' Nicene and Athanasian Creed. Confession, yes. Book of Concord. Gender roles, I just put conservative. Didn't really put a lot of time focusing on that one. Church discipline. So the LCMS uses what are called major and minor bans. And basically this is an excommunication is what it is. So a minor ban would be you're in trouble in your local congregation. And depending on your congregation, these may be more or less common. I've never, in the last year that I've been going to my church, seen or heard of anyone that has received a ban of any kind. I mean, that's not good. Maybe some people should, but a minor ban is like you are being withheld from communion. So you are still allowed to go to the church, but until you repent of whatever the issue that has been raised to you is, you are under a minor ban. A major ban is you are excommunicated from the church. And if I understand it correctly in the LCMS, it has to also be acknowledged by other LCMS churches for it to be a valid major ban. So if that congregation kicks you out, you could get in a situation where you can just go to another LCMS church. You just can't go back to that one. So maybe another LCMS church doesn't have an issue with you, and they welcome you, and you can even take communion or whatever. But if multiple LCMS churches are signing on to that major ban for you, then you're pretty much just kicked out of the synod entirely, and you're no longer Lutheran. Or maybe you are, but you're some other Lutheran at that point. But reverence, I know this one's kind of a weird one. I just meant that they're conducting themselves with reverence in regard to the the service. We don't have what's called the regulative principle of worship, like a Presbyterian church would, where if it's not in the Bible, we're not doing it in church. We allow for a little bit more than that, but Lutheran services are very, very reverent. They're typically not doing, specifically LCMS, I should say, are typically very reverent. You may have a few exceptions that should be disciplined, but by and large, 99%, you're going to have no issue with that. And then purpose of the local church. So there's kind of a big debate between whether a church should be more missional, or you might hear the term like seeker sensitive, or if it should be more, I actually forget what the other specific term for the other side of this discussion is. I wrote down institutional, but basically it's the idea of, do you focus on reaching out and trying to get more people, new people to come to the church? Or do you focus on on having children and catechizing those children and growing the church that way? And I think a proper approach is a little of both. You need to have some of both. I tend to be more institutional, but I think you have to go out and preach the gospel. You can't not have that be any part of your church. But I think right now we're kind of in a point where we put too much focus in being so focused on going out that we are neglecting good catechesis of our children. And that's leading to a lot of people growing up and leaving the church. That's not just in the Lutheran church. That's in many churches. But I actually, at this point, this video's gone on so long, so I'm not going to get into any of the Tier 3 stuff. I originally wrote stuff down, but we can discuss more of the LCMS another day. But that is it in a nutshell. So again, to recap, so step 3 is study. And what I would do, take a look at that list of all the different traditions and make whatever edits you think are appropriate. And I would select just a few. I wouldn't say, hey, I want to go to a church on one church from every tradition on this list. I guess if you really want to knock yourself out, I stuck to about 3 or 4. It was mostly a search. I mostly visited other Baptist churches, Reformed churches, and Lutheran churches. So I guess 3. 3 major traditions that occupy my time, and I really didn't consider any of the rest of them. I mean, I did consider the Roman Catholic Church and decided not to go that way, and for reasons I'll discuss in another video. But familiarize yourself with that list, and then I would use this template. And if you need to write each of these on a separate piece of paper, do so, or a Word document, whatever it is. And I would pick, maybe 3, and you can always expand this later. So pick 3 traditions to start with. I would have one of those 3 be the tradition you are currently in. Start with that one, fill it in. That way you can the goal with this template that I'm getting at here is to give you a really good snapshot of this is what you should expect from a Baptist church, from a Lutheran church, from a Methodist church. That way, and obviously I don't have enough on my channel right now to really help you understand what those traditions should be teaching and should have in each of those slots, but go look at Redeemed Zoomer. Go look at Ready to Harvest. Go and do your own research. Get into these documents that they have. Do some research online, kind of figure it out and fill it in, because then you are going to refer to these time and time and time again. And what you can do, what we're going to get into in the next step is, so if I've written this whole page of information out for what I should expect from an LCMS church, and in the next step, when I'm starting to build my list of churches I want to visit, and I show up to a church and, oh my gosh, they are re-baptizing people. They are not just baptizing infants, they're baptizing them again as adults. That should conflict with what I've got on that page, and that should be a big red flag that church is probably one, even though it has LCMS Lutheran on the sign. You probably need to run far away from and fast, because they are contradicting what they ought to be teaching. So that's and you know what, if nothing else, it's a good exercise to give you an appreciation of what your Christian brothers feel convicted on and what they believe. So I'm sure I have gone way past the point of rambling and barely making sense. One day I will revisit all these videos and edit these to give you something more visual. I know it's very hard to sit here and listen to someone just talk. That's why I try to use my description section as much as I can to share with you guys. But I've got very limited time and resources, so thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, let me know. I would be happy to help either answer in comments or recover in another video in the future. But that was step 3, study, and you're going to keep doing this process. Start with the 3 and then move on and continue to study as you are going throughout the rest of the process. And we'll talk about step 4 next time, which is beginning to build your big list. So thank you very much for coming and listening, and God bless you, and we'll see you next time.